Okay, good afternoon. We are Group 11 and we focused on the transition from education to employment. We'll specifically in this presentation look at the analysis of power a discourse holds on society and the amount of subsequent shifting of responsibility between consumer citizens and the state. So just to provide a brief overview, it's quite apparent from Altram's reading in 2014 that the transition from education to employment will have implications on one's life course. Career path dependency can be both dependent on or can both have political and social factors. This presentation aims to explore the transition one makes through the linear life cycle with relevance to the enterprising or entrepreneurial discourse coincided with the active citizen and the flexibility discourses in attempts to analyse the power and conformity from contemporary Western society. This whilst providing our personal experience to validate these discourses as considerations of power shift involved in this transition. Although we're aware of the vast complexities involved in those whom don't abide to these discourses concerning a smooth transition, due to rebelling against the capitalist agenda, this presentation will specifically focus on those whom do conform to making this transition as smooth for themselves as possible with an acceptance of the enterprising discourse. As an introduction, we searched for a Guardian article that stated that companies are now looking for people with graduate degrees, and therefore it's very important for you to go to university if you're looking to better your life in the long run. However, this transition from education to employment does come with its complexities due to skill adaptations. There's a growing impetus for students to both go to university whilst also gaining experience. For a lot of people, this option isn't a viable one for reasons which we'll explore throughout this passage. The transition will come with its complexities as it requires a large adaptation of skill set, as mentioned. However, the transition is open to a lot of post-education choices. However, some aren't actually viable for some individuals, which FAYEZ will talk through later within the passage. And as Blossfield and Mills state that due to globalisation and technical change, it's becoming increasingly more difficult. There is a catch-22 case of how do you actually get into employment without this required experience that employers are now seeking, and then obviously you can't gain this experience without having employment, so it's a massive complexity for young people. But these young people do perceive success to be very similar across the board. Within this contemporary world, this capitalist society, Hespit in 2006 stated that success, prestige and status are typically associated with our ability, namely by how much we earn. So it's very much a financial aspect of life. If you're financially stable, you're more successful. And then Brunilla and Sivanen, they said that being entrepreneurial is only in this way we are able to become lifelong learners who actively contribute to the flourishing market economy, which re-supports this idea of you've got to continue to learn to be attractive on the CV to employers. As Garrick and Usher both reiterate, they say that everyone is forever in the pursuit of a capitalist agenda, and everyone wants to abide by what people tell them to do, what the state tells them to do. But hang on, why do we want to conform to these employers, and why do we continuously seek this lifestyle that perhaps isn't for us? Foucault believed that under the right conditions and with support, individuals could be persuaded to act in desired ways, not through laws and formal powers, but through activation of their desires, cited from Hamilton, Mitchell and Mangan in 2014. So this puts impetus on the contemporary education system, where over the years there's been a massive shift from learning to apply trade, for instance, to now focusing on self-conceptualisation and developing a more rounded set of employability skills. Berglund and others in 2017 split and segmented the education into two phases. First, early education, where it tends to emphasise pupils as free spirits, untarnished by cultural norms, and they can be stimulated and activated to produce new and creative ideas. And then the latter side of the education is a more emphasis on pupils being business people and preparing them for the wider world. This involves team playing activities. Individuals are then expected to be useful in society and take responsibility through inventing products and services and building up functioning business organisations, and therefore the concentration changes from creativity to more a realistic way of teaching. So this now moves us into the more specific discourse, so the enterprising self-discourse, which will be the talking point of this presentation. Rose in 1996 stated that it's the ideological political discourse which provides norms for thoughts and actions. And looking from the paradigmatic perspective that we'd associate with Foucault, as previously mentioned, we can talk about the above phases of life and the transitions between those with consideration of the cultural expectations around particular subjectivities by focusing on the enterprising self-discourse. This discourse will focus on, it's extremely powerful in Western culture. It's grown to be the norm in a way, so powerful that young people don't even question it anymore and just do what they're told effectively. Cited from Hamilton, Mitchell and Mangum, Foucault in 1983 said that we learn to become socialised into accepting and maintaining these discourses, internalising them as truths, to reiterate. However, it's also a case of everything should be controlled to the point of self-sustenance without the need for intervention. So the impetus is now on the individual rather than the actual state. There's been a transition from responsibility from the state to now, if you don't do well in life, it's purely down to the individual because everything is your responsibility. To continue on in the enterprising self-discourse, Ulrich and Verne basically argue that if you don't abide by this discourse, then you're going to be you're guaranteed permanent inadequacy, and employers won't find you attractive because there's people out there who are prepared to continuously learn, and therefore it's simply a case of learning to make your CV look better even at the latter stages of your life. So why do people want to do that when there's not just one traditional way of living, but you can do whatever you want in life, but according to this enterprising self-discourse, people will the state stops you from doing that because they say you educate yourself throughout life to ensure you remain attractive. And now we'll look at the characteristics of the enterprising self as briefly described so far, and Evans will talk you through these.
Right, so adding up to enterprising self, enterprise have its own characteristics. So looking at the positive one, according to the discourse, if you have a positive characteristic, you are perceived to be more successful in a society and more employable. However, if you have a negative characteristic such as uneducated, you are perceived as less employable and less successful in a society.
Thank you, Evan. So just to reiterate that point, that there are these both positive and negative characteristics associated with the discourse. And Foucault presents the suggestion that your life is expected to follow the traditional linear life model of gaining a good education, leading to successful employment and ending with happy retirement effectively. It's just the social norm due to the power of the discourse being so strong. So the positive characteristics were listed by Evans are just the norm for people to abide by. And this is supported by Paul Willis in his Learning to Labour book in 1977, where he argued that there's a systemic way in which education promotes particular types of behaviour, where, as reiterated, if you're good and disciplined, you'll do well. However, if you're disruptive and rude, engage in bad activities and don't attend class, there's a very different culture expected of you in the future. This reverts back to the Foucauldian perspective, using the same framework. We can look at how people have the mentality that if they do rebel and don't do as they're told, they're going to ruin their own life choices because the responsibility is purely on themselves and not the state. This all comes from the pressure that exerted through political discourse with an impetus on the responsibilisation. So that's the discourse of being responsible. And if you're not responsible, you're not going to do well. It's down on you. It's down to you, nobody else, not the structure or the system, the state, you. So moving on into a real life example, from a personal perspective, an experience of mine that has been complementary of this entrepreneurial enterprising self-discourse was my work experience, where I proactively sought to make a better me. I've personally learned to abide by and conform to the powers of this discourse by understanding that without this work experience that I gained over the time I've been educated, regardless of whether or not I get a degree, I won't be able to get a good job due to so many like-minded individuals attacking the same field, all in the pursuit of that capitalist agenda to work that 9-to-5 postgraduate job. Keele University didn't actually offer a sandwich degree where you take a year out into the industry, but I realised that without this sandwich degree, I didn't feel as if I was going to be competing against those that had one, and therefore I took it upon myself, showing positive characteristics of the enterprising self, to look for internships and actually have to take a leave of absence. And this obviously supports the responsibilisation discourse. I'd say work experience is a means of acquiring non-academic skills, but still learning in a non-educated system. And ultimately, the contemporary environment now means it's my responsibility rather than the state's. And there at the bottom, you can see that the Independent reported that employers are now seeking people with experience over qualifications, which is extremely important for young people to realise that it's not all about abiding to this education system of doing your work and then going into the work environment, but also coinciding it with their experience, which supports the enterprising self discourse. However, this discourse does come with its limitations. Although it sounds as if it's just the social norm, it's a very simplistic nature. For instance, there's sociological problems and inequalities. They're rendered invisible by this discourse, which FAYEZ will briefly touch upon in an example next. And at the end of the day, we're only human, and the fact of anything can happen tomorrow needs to come into account. So at the end of the day, you need to live your life not seeking this capitalist agenda, but doing what makes you you, not conforming to being a certain type of person just because society and the state tells you to be that person. We forget sometimes that this extremely powerful discourse, however hard you try, you might not be successful, so why waste your time with it? That's the mentality of some people. So the rationale behind seeking entrepreneurialism, Fenwick 2001 described that people want to be more individual and they want to work for themselves because the work organisations that they previously worked for, they felt undervalued and repressed. And this is often the case. People don't feel as if they're getting enough credit for the work they're doing. And people will talk about the creative dream and to create their own work environments. However, we have an example here from FAYEZ who's kind of it critiques this example where he can further explain an example where the entrepreneurialism didn't actually come into account.
So, while considering the enterprising self-discourse, I believe my case is quite unique. Through my own experience on education, I've realized that there are certain limitations to the discourse as explained previously by Tom. To put into perspective, I perhaps do not necessarily need to obtain a degree from university to appear more attractive to employers. However, this is only the case because my father has worked hard through his position in his company and his networking capabilities. I seem attractive to employers through my father's success. In other words, my chances of employability are given to me through my father. However, while attempting to critique the self-enterprising discourse, I realized a significant dilemma. Self-enterprising discourse advocates the idea of an individual obtaining educational degrees and work experience, and while I do not necessarily need to have it to get employed, my own success will then depend on whether or not the same case could be applied to my children, or even their children. Theoretically, if I were to be extremely successful and pass down great inheritance, the self-enterprising discourse will eventually be the norm that will not die. In other words, my children will seek education and work experience to have better prospect of employability.
Thanks. So on the completely other end of the scale, Paul Willis, in his Learning to Labour book again, identifies that some individuals can be disadvantaged through context rather than merit. So where FAYEZ obviously has been advantaged, there are people in socio-economic backgrounds that simply don't have these opportunities that arise in more middle to upper class cultures. And we can see this through Durkheim's perspective of the mechanical solidarity versus the organic solidarity, where there's been definitely a shift from collective consciousness into more an independence environment. So people they're not so afraid to kind of sit within their boundaries nowadays, but instead show traits of that enterprising self by moving out and being the best person they can be, and basically neglecting any intergenerational problems or influences they may have. For instance, my father wanted me to become a carpenter because he was a carpenter. He said it was a great trade. However, I realised the industry isn't performing as well as it was in his time, and therefore I rebelled against his request and went to university because I realised that's what I wanted to achieve in and succeed in. And reverting back to the examples, it's a case of sometimes this enterprising self-discourse doesn't take into account these backgrounds, and therefore it is just a too simplistic way of looking at things. So moving on to the next discourse, we'll look at the neoliberalist citizenship discourse. So what's the idea of being an active citizen? Cameron 2012 said it was to be more engaged in social action, to take problems into your own, to tackle problems in your own community. So this puts an impetus on not so much learning with the intention of then earning money, but instead learning to give back to the community. And what's so important about this is it relates back to the fact that we are only human and anything could happen tomorrow. So the self-conceptualization of are you happy with what you've become can't truly be achieved if you haven't given back to your community. Also, alongside this form of neoliberal citizenship, there's the idea of everyone is a consumer to something. And for instance, you either consume, you're consuming the labour market where you're working and you're being paid for this, or you're consuming education to the state, so you're bettering your chances of then getting into the labour market. And what's interesting here is that the government are so tied down in making sure an individual is either within this education or within this labour market to ensure that there's little friction on the streets and prevention of needs within the westernised cultures. So with this community, we then look at how it can be applied, how soft skills can come into application, where Ultram says that all aspects of life geared towards competition. It's not so much the case now, because we have an example here of someone who has their soft skills learnt through a type of work that has benefited them within the community.
So, although Teresa advocated that all aspects of life are geared towards competition, I've utilised mine to help within the community. My experience in the world of work consists of being a part-time waiter in a family-run restaurant. This has meant that I've learned soft skills in the workplace, such as communication skills with customers, as well as with co-workers due to being part of a team. On top of this, there's time management skills and self-motivation, which Sisson and Jones discovered. This is an example of within these discourses that I've taken responsibility for my own training to take forward into employment. These are skills that wouldn't be achieved from a university education necessarily, meaning that in this case education does not prepare someone for the world of work in terms of practical skills as previously mentioned. This correlates with Zamblias' theory of individuals such as myself needing to adapt and upgrade their personal skills in anticipation of demands of work after education.
Thank you, George. So just to wrap up the points we've talked through, it's a case now of this enterprising self-discourse being so powerful through our own experience proving so that it has just become the cultural norm for Western society seeking that capitalist agenda, when really this could restrict us from seeking our true dreams, but it's all we know. So then we look at a flexibility discourse, which we haven't talked through within the presentation, but is an important note, that anything is possible with hard work, and you don't have to conform to any sort of society that the state puts on yourself. And students should be exploited in the early stages of their life, in the juvenile stages of the life cycle model, to employment opportunities, which has been seen at Keele University in the CRIS projects, just to give them a taste of the employability skills they need to succeed in life. And it's not all about education, but all of these examples sway to one seeking a more entrepreneurial self, always looking to better themselves and ensuring that they're better than the competition out there available.
So now we're just going to look at further additional questions we would like to ask and give our own interpretation to. So the first question will be answered by Chris.
Okay. The question is, to what extent has government employer professional association policy on job opportunity or education influenced your experience? As a international student, if I want to work here, I have to follow the rules by the home office that I have a work time limit every month. So it also ensure that I can put my attention on my education, and also I can have the opportunity to work.
Additionally to this, there's obviously a UK legislation recently come in to stay in any form of full-time education until the age of 18. So this is the government putting an impetus on making sure that one becomes as entrepreneurial and as employable as possible. That was in 2008. And that's very important, that the government is making sure these people aren't on the streets and becoming sort of not in education or employment, to make the competition as wide as possible throughout the UK.
Moving on to the next question, I'd like to take this personally. Would you describe your university studies as an investment? My case again is quite unique. I'm personally funded by my government, so in other words, I'm on scholarship and I don't necessarily have to pay for my university fees or my accommodation fees. However, that doesn't neglect the pressure that I have as an expectation of my government to come back with a good degree and good grades. However, I'm sure that for cases like those of other international students who come here by their own parents' money or their own money, obviously their situation is different. Tom will further answer this question.
So, albeit FAYEZ's point is amazing for the international side of things, it's also important to look at, as an active citizen, what you're actually consuming. And it is an investment in the case of you're investing this as opposed to investing outside of education. So you're not getting paid and therefore you're actually paying. So this is putting you at detriment later down the line to having to pay these fees back. But in the long term, my personal experience has suggested that this degree will open many more doors than it would have if I just came out of school in the early stages. And to the employer now, it's as if just having this accolade on my CV is invaluable in the aspect of finance.
Also, as an international student, I pay my own fees, but the fees is being funded by my father's company. So to the company, this is a form of investment because they expect me to come back and work for the company. So in my case, the university is a form of investment, and me getting a good degree will be a good investment for the company that supports my education.
Moving on to the final question. Do you feel there is a fair balance of costs to benefits in your training?
So just reverting back to the prior theory used in the second question, the active citizen discourse, we choose to consume the education over employment at this early stage because the power of the enterprising self discourse is so strong on these young individuals in the Western culture. The answer to this question won't be proven wrong or right for myself until I've actually achieved this employment and I've retired and I've looked back on it and I've said, yeah, that degree really did take me to where I wanted to be or not. And it's a case of the balance from cost to benefits won't actually truly be able to be evaluated until the latter stages of my working life.
Thank you very much for listening.